Good evening and welcome to For the Record. I am Edwin Nand. Tonight we're speaking about the 16 days of activism to end gender violence. It's about 2 weeks of intense public awareness and activities by non-government organizations and women's groups to raise awareness on violence against women and children. And in studio to speak with us tonight is Sharon Bhagwan Rolls, the Executive Director of Femlink. Sharon, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Femlink has been very heavily involved with women's groups and women's rights issues for a number of years now.
Almost 15.
Well, there you go, almost 15 years. These 16 days, every year, this time of the year, how important is it for Femlink and for women's groups?
I think for women's rights groups around the world at the global level, it's one of the biggest global campaigns that has been organized or initiated by women's rights activists back in 1991. And in fact, the Fiji Women's Crisis Center's coordinator, Shamima Ali, has been a beacon in terms of bringing home the 16 days of activism after she attended the sort of founding conference in that year. And the Crisis Center, together with other women's rights groups, have taken on board the campaign as a way to communicate that for the 16 days, which includes a number of other human rights days and observations like Disability Rights, World AIDS Day, we've just had the International Day for Volunteers, and of course World Human Rights Day. But it's been a platform in terms of addressing the multiple forms of violence against women. It's been, as you said, 16 days of focused action from the local to the national, to the regional, and to the global. And so it is from around the world. The way we're now organizing is our messages as Femlink from a 16 days of community radio broadcast in Lambasa town is being shared across a global platform using social media, using podcasting. So I think it's also about being part of that global campaign to say no form of violence is appreciated, is right, and that we are looking more and more at the multiple forms of violence. So it's violence in the home, violence in the community, violence across the world. So with the theme this year, the end to gender-based violence and the link to militarism over the last couple of years with the global theme, it's also been inclusive of the Women, Peace and Security campaign, and looking at human security rather than a militaristic security. So extremely important for women's rights groups, and the way in which the community is also embracing the campaign is fantastic. Yeah.
That's a good point you bring up. How receptive is it? Because Femlink, of course, has always had a community approach in its programs. When you go out there over the 16 days and you speak to people, what sort of responses do you get?
We get, because community radio and has been enabling young women, older women, particularly in rural communities, to come together and talk about the issues. So recently, some of the radio campaigns have highlighted that there is still a prevalence of violence. Violence is visible, whether it's a black eye, whether it's the punches, the sort of the youth-related violence, young men towards young women, that it's there. Yet community leaders aren't responding. We don't have that kind of grassroots community approach in many centers. We're also seeing that women are feeling empowered. The fact that they're part of a global campaign and the connections between the work of, as I said, the Crisis Center in terms of advocating and being that strong voice, demanding justice, demanding accountability through the legal system, through the police system as well. They're feeling more empowered, and you can see that through the numbers that are being reported. But at the same time, there's still barriers to reporting. And what women are saying is that we do actually need to almost go back to some of our early work as a movement in terms of legal rights, in terms of knowing what do I do. So women's groups, we have club activities where they invite the Legal Aid Commission. They are aware of information, but they're also communities quite distant, quite away. Infrastructure doesn't work to their advantage. So they're not accessing information and services as the way that we'd like them to. So in terms of the 16 Days campaign and other activities of the women's rights movement, I think it's really important to recognize that 16 days are quite symbolic. It's all the other days as well that the work has to continue. Yeah.
You mentioned the point of more reports being received, more women coming forward to report this. Now, this has always, the women's rights groups have always said this is a positive indicator. More women are aware of their rights, but there's always been a disparity between what police figures are, or what the official figures are of violence against women, and what the NGOs believe is actually going on. So if, let's say, for example, there are 5 reports received about women being, abused physically or sexually, those are the 5 reported. What would you say is the reality on the ground?
I mean, what has the Crisis Centre put out? More than 60% of women have faced some form of violence. And in terms of, I'd say 1 in 3, so if you just look at the population of this country, 1 in 3, and at a young women's training on the day, International Day for Violence Against Women, we asked a little training group that we had, how many women do you know who have experienced violence yet have not reported violence? And it was almost 100%. So even in urban settings where we're quite informed and you would almost imagine things are quite accessible, there is still a level of stigma. There is still a level of that feeling that, society is kind of telling me that violence there is no other way, and that the power over me as a woman is allowed, and that I shouldn't go and, create waves to demand that I live a life free of violence, that my children live a life free of violence. And if you look back at some of the work that's been done, it's quite surprising the number of us who took a very long time to come out on issues of violence. So I think there is still a stigma. I think there is still a need to be more friendly in terms of the services that are available, and that's one of the key messages as well. We can have a no-drop policy, but we also need to see that the police force, and I'm glad that the Crisis Centre is now back on the task force on violence against women and children with the Department of Women, because it's that engendering of the process. How do we make sure that my own attitude as a police person, for example, if a woman comes into the police station to report violence, how am I going to address that person? How am I going to make sure that she feels comfortable? And the time that it may take. So in terms of, your point of why do the numbers seem higher in terms of the figures from the Crisis Centre, of course you will go to a safe space to report it. And the services at the Crisis Centre include counselling, support, safe homes, those kinds of services to enable the journey with the woman right through. So it's not just a matter of rocking up to the station and saying, I've got to report violence. It's not as, superficial as that. Yeah.
On that note, we will take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to For the Record. We're speaking about the 16 days of activism to end violence against women. And in studio with us is the Executive Director of Femlink, Sharon Bhagwan-Rolls. Sharon, before the break you spoke about how women sometimes would not feel safe going to the police station to report violence. But I note that the police is carrying out gender-based training. They obviously have realized that there is a problem that they need to work on. This is a step in the right direction. Absolutely.
And the types of training that needs to be conducted also needs to happen in terms of partnerships with women's rights groups. And, the work of as I said, the Crisis Centre has been a key women's rights organization working in this area. And so the way training is delivered, the learning, everybody really, in terms of state delivery on commitments to eliminate violence against women and children, really have to look at it from a women's human rights lens or a child rights perspective. So it's looking at the violence, there's the domestic violence, there's the violence in the community, in terms of how safe is it for women and girls to walk in the community. So human rights-based training, I think, is really, really important. It would also be important in terms of the role of the police to also look institutionally, to look within and to say, how gender inclusive are we as the police force? We have a divisional commissioner in the north. That's a great step as far as leadership. But we also need to see, the whole point around engendering more women in leadership, because the more women are involved in the leadership, in the decision making of a state institution responsible for the security of every single citizen, regardless of gender, age, ability or disability, then the more we could see some of that institutional transformation. So I think the legal reform process is one thing, but the institutional transformations are quite important, particularly from a rights-based approach.
Would you say tonight that any woman should feel safe walking to a police station and filing a report of domestic violence, let's say, for example?
I would certainly hope so, and I would really encourage women, any woman, any girl who is facing violence, to take that strong faith, step for yourself, because no one deserves that in their lives. And even if you're thinking about what happens to my children, what will other people say, I think if you take that step to address the violence in your life and know that there is support. I mean, in terms of our previous discussion about how is the community embracing the 16 days, I mean, it's great to see faith communities taking a position, sharing prayers, sharing ideas, being open, and the responsibility of the faith community is just as important. As one of our colleagues has been saying, in many of our faith books, nobody says violence against women, or anyone for that matter, is allowed. And so we need to take a whole of community approach. There's a great campaign in India called Bell Bajao, Ring the Bell. And I think that's also a reminder to neighbors that if you hear the violence, you don't turn a deaf ear.
Well, that's been a problem for a long time in Fiji.
Yeah.
I mean, people just don't get up and say, look,
hey, what's going on?
I'm going to stop this.
Yes.
It's none of my business.
Well, it's everyone's business. I mean, we can't live in a society where someone experiences violence. One form of violence, if you add it all up, taking it back to the numbers, there's violence across our society. So, in terms of peace and security, in terms of talking about a peaceful society, if we're not looking at the violence that's being experienced in homes and in communities, how can we say we're a peaceful society? If we're not looking at the root causes as well, what is causing the violence, whether it's attitude towards, as I said, the power over, whether it's this power of I feel stronger because you are different from me or you're born female, or whether it's economic issues. I think we really also need to, as part of this campaign, look at the root causes as well.
When we talk about ending violence, changing the mindset, changing the ball game altogether, men also have to change. Men who beat women or who abuse children have to change. Where are we lacking in that?
I'd like to see, and this is like a purely personal viewpoint based on several observations, that women's human rights is not just the role of women to say, I need to live a life free of violence, or I need to live an equal life in my society, that just because I was born in this way, I should be discriminated against. So in terms of just our own personal attitudes, we have to, the men of our country, all men, whether you're a father, a son, or a brother, we all have to take a responsibility in treating each other with, in an equal manner. Thinking about, what do I say? What are my attitudes towards women? And will I also allow, if I'm somewhere and somebody is being rude or, being horrible to somebody, whether it's on social media or in public spaces, am I just going to be the silent person and not make a difference? So I think each of us have to take that responsibility, that it's not just the role of the women's rights groups. And in terms of leadership, now that we have parliament, now that we have a democratically elected government, I hope that there will be a lot more collaboration with women's rights groups in terms of learning and understanding that if we talk about gender equality, it's men and women of all diversities together. And in terms of women's rights, that the state responsibility there was a commitment made back in 1995 when the government, when the state ratified the UN Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So every single government official, whether you're a district officer or Turangani Koro or a member of a district advisory council, we all have responsibility.
There have been efforts on this front. I mean, Fiji's had a women's action plan for a number of years. This has been revised continuously.
Revised continuously, but very under-resourced, unfortunately. If you look at the budget for this year, only $1 million for the National Women's Plan of Action. There are 5 priority areas. Violence against women is one of the priority areas. Equality in decision making, one of the other priority areas. Women's access to services. So it's, I think in terms of the rollout, until we actually see the figures and the breakdown, $1 million is not enough to bring about a transformation even within the government machinery. We haven't really heard from any single one of the government MPs standing up in terms of the budget to say, of my budget allocation, this percentage is going to be in gender mainstreaming. And that's a policy they're supposed to be practicing. They're not, in terms of seeing the rollout, if I just take, aside from violence against women, in terms of decision making, if you think about the amount of training that needs to be done, whether it's with women's interest officers or government officials, $200,000 for the year is really not enough to make the change.
Okay, Sharon, I'll have to stop you there. It's time to take another break. We'll be back shortly. More discussions coming up. Welcome back once again to For the Record. We're speaking with Sharon Bhagwan Rolls, the Executive Director of FemLink, about the 16 days of activism to end gender violence. Sharon, before the break you spoke about how the National Women's Action Plan needs more work. $1 million is not enough.
Yeah.
Obviously, given the size of the civil service itself, forget about the services that the government offers, $1 million won't be enough, but there are other priority areas that the government is working on. And this action plan, I understand, has been in the pipeline for a number of years, and it has stumbled along the way progressively over the years, but it seems now there is something being done about it.
I think catalytic was, the whole lead up to the Beijing conference, and we have to acknowledge that while we were preparing to go to the Beijing conference, the 4th UN Conference of Women in 95, we had a 20-year legacy ahead of that, longer in fact. The women's rights movement has been very active in terms of identifying the need for a Department of Women, because that wasn't established until, interestingly, after the 87 coup. But in 1985, if you take 1985, that was when, after the Third World Conference on Women, they adopted the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies. And one of the key commitments from UN member states, including Fiji at the time, was the establishment of a national women's machinery. As a young girl, I thought it was about a big truck driving women, but it wasn't. It was about setting up an institution responsible for gender equality. That was ticking along, and so we had the 87 coup. The first Minister for Women, however, was appointed at the time, Andi Finau Tambakau Doro. And so there was like a little bit of a rollout of things happening, but everything kind of spiraled into place 94, 95, ahead of the Beijing conference, assisted by the adoption of a Pacific Platform for Action. And of course, just before Fiji went to the conference, almost 20 years ago, they ratified CEDAW. So with that convention, the sort of treaty compliance, treaty commitment going to the Beijing conference, in 1998, as a result of the conference, the National Women's Plan of Action was adopted with 5 key areas. Gender mainstreaming was one. So in terms of the focus being, let's get our house in order as the government to bring in gender mainstreaming, which is a process. It's not a project, it's not an activity, it's a process of, as I said, what does this road mean to a man? What does it mean to a woman? What does access to education mean for a girl, for a boy? So there were some pilot programs, and there were dribs and drabs of sort of the meetings of what are supposed to be task forces dedicated to these priority areas. But then, of course, we had 2000. Things picked up again in 2001, and that's really when we started getting involved in terms of women's access to decision making. And that, incorporated things like women's portrayal in the media and access to the media, women, peace and security. So the task forces are really at the capital city level in terms of bringing in, the deputy permanent secretary or director level from other ministries. So the Public Service Commission being responsible for decision making. But really, it has to roll out to that local level, to where is the DO, what is the role of the District Advisory Council. So that's what I mean when I say if we're allocating $200,000 to roll out gender equality, in decision making, it's really not going to get very far in terms of the training, the changes, the policy, the practice that has to happen on a day-to-day basis. We need to be able to be supporting the civil servants in terms of really understanding what is my responsibility, because the Fiji government has made this commitment to gender equality and women's rights, in fact, not just gender equality. What is my responsibility? So there needs to be a lot of rethinking, and we have had a gap of almost 8 years without parliamentary democracy. So the lack of engagement with rights-based groups as well, there's been a serious gap. Some progress. The Cabinet in February 2014 adopted a national gender policy, and a number of women's organizations have started to, get back into engaging on policy issues. But it's one thing to have the policy. If the policy is not resourced, if the action on the ground is not being resourced, if the attitudes are not changing, if women's interest officers are not feeling empowered enough that they can provide advice to the provincial administrator, to the district officer, to the divisional commissioner, then you're not seeing gender equality institutionalized and that kind of transformation happening.
That would be the work of the government. But
yes,
my question to you is, how can the women's rights groups help in this regard? Are you working
yes,
with the government?
Partnerships are key in terms of the local level delivery, in terms of, if you think about the work, what we've been doing over the last 8 years is bringing women together on a local level, engaging with government officials through interactive dialogue to be able to get the connections happening. But we have seen through that process that there needs to be a few extra days just to work with the government officials to even understand, we did have a local government official stand up recently and say, well, we really don't understand women. And what do you need? And it's like, oh, okay, that needs some training, or that needs some conversation.
Isn't that a good thing for them to actually stand up and say?
Yes, it is, that they're actually finally, they're willing to admit to a room full of, 40 women of all diversities that we do need to better understand this thing, gender equality. So that's really important. The fact that we do hear that the affirmation of commitments, I think that's really important as well, that it's not been lost along the way. But I think there is a definite need for enhanced collaboration. But that collaboration is not about let's meet in the capital city. It's really, how do we collaborate and bring our networks together? How can we bring our rural women's networks, the Songasonga Wakamarama, the National Council of Women, the other women's groups networks together at the local level, at the divisional level, and have those conversations in the development planning process, so that when in April 2015 the government process starts for the national budget, they are starting to say, hey, we know that there are these women's groups out there, let's have this brainstorming with them. It's as simple as that. But also recognizing that some of those rural women leaders are 20-25 kilometers out of town. So it's also not about just reaching out to the women who are in the town, but bringing women through a process of leadership as well, leadership training. And that way we can see the women are in district advisory councils, are in the different committees of government as well.
Sharon, it's time for another break. We'll be right back. Pulvanaka, welcome back to For the Record. We'll get right into it. Sharon, I want to take you back to something you said a lot earlier in the show. Let's go back to the community focus of ending gender violence. You mentioned that there is youth violence. You spoke about how young men or young women are being abused. We would
Facing
have thought,
violence.
well, facing violence. Okay, I would have thought that the youth were actually the ones who wouldn't be doing this because they come from a newer generation. They're more exposed to the world and more
And all good
even-minded.
things.
Well, that was my thinking. I mean,
Well, first of all,
obviously, it seems I was wrong.
First of all, we're not part of this sort of homogeneous mix, right? So in terms of the rural-urban divide, so if you think about, yes, there are some very positive influences out there in terms of the awareness raising around 16 Days campaign, male champions, positive leadership and role models, but there is an urban-rural divide. Think about young people in a community where very limited internet, electricity, communications, and you're sitting around, hoping for some form of employment. Your education's been disrupted. So, if you go back to what is the violence, your sphere of influence also perpetuates violence. Maybe not the physical violence, but certainly the structural violence that says, in our community, as young men, you are welcome into this hall. We could sit around with you and converse because you are the males, and the females are over there outside, and we will tell them when we're hungry and all of that kind of stuff. So that kind of negative power is actually being perpetuated in many communities. And so it was quite disturbing for me to see through some of our community radio programs coming out of the north that this is exactly what young women are talking about, the kind of power over, that young men in rural communities feel that they can have their way, be, whether it's physical or verbal abuse, and that negative power as well. So it is a reality, and it is a challenge in terms of some of the great work that's being done by young people organizing themselves. We're part of the Fiji Young Women's Forum. We're supporting young women, and there's a greater focus on how to involve rural young women. But in terms of engaging with young men, so we also need to, as women's rights-based groups, also look at how can we engage through youth councils. Very interesting that in a number of provincial youth councils, there isn't gender equality either. So we need to also look at what are the dynamics in terms of decision-making, which is why I really think that, when we're talking about violence and the multiple forms of violence, if we're not connecting it to the kind of access to power and decision making, you will forever be telling, anyone who's not sort of heteronormative male that you don't belong at the table.
How closely connected is this youth violence to the sort of the old school mentality, or learning from what's been practiced in the past?
I think there's definitely that sort of perpetuation of some of those, that the patriarchy. That, as I said, the women are not supposed to be in that space. We will call you, but otherwise don't say anything. And it is about a month ago, we were having one of our network consultations in Nosori, and to hear one of the women actually say that, and I keep hearing that. That's really disturbing, that while I have been so lucky to grow up with parents who said, have an opinion, have a voice, look what happened. But in terms of women my age, younger women living in communities where they're just basically told, shut up.
Sharon, this has been our way of life for hundreds of years. Who are you to come and tell me to change it? There's nothing wrong with it. Why are you interfering?
Because, at the end of the day, women are working so hard. They're providing so much for their communities and for their families, yet they're still struggling. I mean, when you think about the health of families, a woman will organize to make sure she's sitting in the hospital for hours and hours for her children. She will make sure that her husband is well because he's the one going to work. And at the end of the day, our values as a society, whatever our faith, we owe it to the other person to practice equality. We say we may be a secular state, but we're all very strong in terms of our individual faiths and beliefs. that equality has got to come from within, and we can't keep treating people like that.
How far ahead have we come over the years? Take me back 30, 40 years and give me a picture today.
Gosh, I was in my cradle then. But in terms of, I mean, if I link it back to the stories that have been shared through the women's rights movement and things that I've learned as a young woman growing up in the movement, you know, in my 20s, hearing how the struggle was there even within the women's movement. The fact that, you know, you saw the emergence of rights-based groups like the Crisis Center, like the Women's Rights Group, Fiji Women's Rights Movement, in terms of stepping out and saying rape is wrong. We've got to speak out against violence against women. So there was a tension, even, you know, sort of post-independence Fiji. And the emergence then, you know, that's really paved the way in terms of the, for want of a better word, you know, the diversification of the women's rights groups. You know, Femlink focuses on media and peace. We've got groups working on sexual orientation, gender identity, environmental issues. So we have emerged a long way as far as this legacy of women's rights in our country. The recent example of us all collaborating with the government at the the Asia Pacific Conference on gender equality, you know, for Beijing Plus 20 was a key example of how women's rights-based groups can provide information and advice, and government is receptive and listening. But as I said, there's sort of the institutional, if the institutional changes don't happen, then there is no point, because we're civil society. You know, we're women coming into a process saying we don't agree with what's going on, and we can provide voice to lots of other women, young women who also feel the same. But we also need that collaboration with the government, with other members of society as well, including other civil society groups as well. If you think about leadership in terms of trade unions, other entities. So we have come a long way. We're seeing women from Fiji participating in regional platforms, international platforms. So we're taking our voices and issues into the global gender equality, women's rights movement as well. But back home, I think we've regressed. You know, we have these stops and starts, and then we have some kind of national crisis, which is one of the reasons why women's rights groups, like other civil society groups, are engaging in terms of wanting to see peace and stability within the country as well.
All right. On that note, it's time for another break. We'll be right back. Good evening, and this is the last segment for our show tonight. We're speaking with Sharon Bhagwan Rolls, the Executive Director of Femlink. Sharon, NGOs or women's rights groups are anti-violence, not anti-men.
Absolutely. You know, it is about, we kind of have to really unpack it. I think sometimes it's really, you know, just very easy for people to say, oh, you hate all men. Actually, I don't. We don't. It is about, as I said, living in a society where we can all make decisions together, where we can live a life free of violence, where we can walk down the street and know that we're not going to be harassed. We can send our children to the shop or to the movies by themselves. So it's about everybody, you know. It is really about addressing some of those barriers to having a peaceful and just society. So taking a rights-based approach is very important as well, because it's not just about the sort of superficial window dressing. You know, it's not enough just to put a billboard up and say this is a violence-free community if we're not addressing the root causes of the violence. It's not enough to set up women's resource centers, which is important for women to come together, but if you're not addressing the power structures that may govern that resource center in that community. So those are some of the things that we keep making the connection to, that it's not just about women in development projects. We have to address the root causes of any form of discrimination or the multiple forms of violence.
There would be people sitting at home saying, what are these guys talking about? I haven't heard of any violence recently.
Well,
there haven't
then
been
they're
any
really
incidents
lucky.
of rape.
I want to live in your utopian world then.
But there is that mentality.
yeah.
If you don't see it, it's not happening.
yeah.
There is that train
Yeah.
of thought.
So, I mean, that's where I think, you know, I'll speak as a parent now, because I think it's really important for each of us to think about, we can live in a comfort zone, but if we're not thinking about, or we're not helping our children understand that we might be lucky, but what about that other person? If you walk past someone and there is, you know, we talked earlier about if you hear the violence, you ignore it, or do you stand up as a good citizen, as a strong, faith-based person, and do something about it? So we have to take responsibility. Life is not perfect, and if every single one of us did something to make life better, not just for ourselves, but for someone else. And we're doing amazing work in terms of, if you look at some of the projects in terms of, you know, the Hilton School, the work that's been done for early intervention in education, the provision of schools for girls in this country is a major commitment as far as gender equality. But then there's the next step. It's not enough just to get into primary school. And I really think that, you know, as a society, we could be doing so much more together. Yeah.
Drawing to the end of the show, the 16 days of activism, a number of activities are held. There's a lot of awareness that goes on, but on a holistic level, on a national level, how effective is it in terms of getting the message across?
It's imperative that the message is out there every year, and that's, as I said from the outset, that being part of a global campaign is so incredibly important. The different agencies who have come in over time to support the entire 16 Days campaign, as I said, which was birthed from the women's rights movement, that unfortunately, if you understand the root, you know, the symbolism of November 25th, it's actually about the death or the assassination of women in the Dominican Republic who stood up to a dictatorship, and 3 out of the 4 sisters were assassinated. So it is about recognizing that there are multiple forms of violence, and that violence does stop women, stop girls, young women in all our diversities from participating as equal citizens. We have gender equality, sexual orientation, all enshrined in the Constitution. I think the next step is, you know, after we celebrate or commemorate World Human Rights Day on the 10th of December, is to say, okay, December 11th, what are we going to do for the rest of the year? You know, for the rest of the campaign. How do we take that campaign on board in terms of our day-to-day living, in terms of what we're doing in our faith communities, what we're doing in our youth groups, and in terms of society?
How receptive are communities and individuals to the work that the women's rights group do? I'm not talking about the victims of violence. I'm not talking about the women, but maybe the perpetrators or men who may have turned a blind eye or who may be ignorant to the issue.
I think the more people are speaking out themselves, we could see that. But, you know, it's nice every now and then when a gentleman will stop you and say, you know, good on you, we enjoyed that program, or, you know, it's really good what the women's groups are doing. But at the same time, we also know that quite often I think that when people will challenge, or they'll say, you know, why are you doing this? It's actually an opportunity for us to educate and to say, well, we're actually doing this for this reason. This is my personal belief. It's one of the things that I feel I can contribute, or our organization can contribute to a whole movement, a legacy of, it wasn't just a few of us got together, you know, and said, right, let's cause some trouble. But if you look at the legacy of the women's movement, and the way women have organized from communities to come together to engage prior to independence and to participate in different channels, it's really that legacy of my mother's generation, my grandmother's generation of women that we're giving back as women in different forms. Yeah.
Sharon, thank you very much for being on the show tonight.
Thank you.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. Remember, 16 days of activism against violence against women. I hope I got that right. If you know of anyone who's a victim of violence, don't be silent if it's in your community. If you see a woman being abused on the streets or anywhere for that matter, don't stand by and let it happen. You, as a citizen of this country, have a responsibility to stop it. And if anyone who's watching tonight is interested in learning more, I'm sure they can get in touch with FemLink or the Fiji Women's Crisis Center or any women's rights group in Fiji. Their contacts are readily available. But for us, on For the Record, that is the show tonight. We'll be back again next Sunday. For comments or questions, you can email us fortherecord@fbc.com.fj. For now, from me, good evening.